topics as headed by Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu. He is actually consolidating and implementing all decisions of internal affairs and nationwide projects. Among other capacities, he is also leading the deregulation program, a step that we have given an entire session to this morning. He is also head of the National Infrastructure Program of Israel, and he's head of the steering committee on smart transportation. Eli Groner is also the head of the Joint Task Force for China and Israel, and he is in charge of tightening the relations with Africa and India. He is also head of the Supreme Steering Committee for the moving of the IDF bases to the Negev. He was also one of the leaders of the gas outline, and he is also taken part in the setting up of the headquarters of cyber. And before entering office in the Prime Minister's office, he was also an economic attaché in Washington between 2011 and 2014. His positions in the public sphere have been preceded by positions in McKinsey and Tnuva in the private sector. He has a BA from Bar-Ilan University and an MA from New York University, NYU. He lives in El Azhar with his wife Tamar and their 5 children. That was so long that my father would have laughed and my mother would have believed it. So you probably got too long a version of my bio. This feedback is called a high-tech nation. There are many question marks. If I were to synthesize all the commentary into one word, the answer is yes. Yes, we are a high-tech superpower, and the government is doing everything that a government should do in order to advance that. International agreements that are of high importance. We are lowering taxes, corporate taxes and VAT. We are already in the implementation of a government plan to increase the number of engineers by 40%. However, on the other hand, there is one place, a central place, where we are absolutely, until 2015, we were like a third world country. And if there were a fourth world country, we'd be it. I'm talking about the thing that impacts more than anything else the cost of living. I'm talking about something that is so dangerous because it works quietly, and many educated people do not understand the damage and implications of this threat. I am talking, of course, about over or excess regulation. In 2015, we were rated 98th in terms of regulatory burden. That is what the World Economic Forum said. That's how they ranked us. We were ranked after Ghana, lower than Ethiopia, lower than Egypt. And how did we get that far? Well, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps Josephus, if he had seen Israel today, Professor Degani, would say he was wrong, but I think he too would have agreed that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And there were all sorts of good legislators and good regulators whose good intentions added more and more regulations, one on top of the other, and so we have gotten to the 98th spot on the list, after Ethiopia. And since the law, the most basic and fundamental law and rule of economics is that there are no free lunches, and since the cost in the system, be it necessary or redundant, ends up being paid by the consumer eventually, these regulations had directly impacted not only the cost of living, but all the significant economic indexes. What you see in this slide is a correlation, or rather a proof, that significant correlation between smart regulation and growth. What you see here is all the OECD countries. Before I talked about the World Economic Forum, we were ranked number 98. But according to the OECD, 35 countries are in the OECD. They rank each and every country according to its smart regulation. And since we're talking about an analysis that is so complex, they only do it once every 5 years. That is the update in 2013, and in the second half of 2018 we'll get this year's update. The x-axis is all the OECD countries, and if you can see, Israel in 2013 was number 34 out of 35 in terms of regulatory burden in the OECD countries. And the y-axis is GDP per capita, but you can see here a statistically significant correlation between excess regulation and GDP and cost of living and growth. And I'm saying it's a good thing that Turkey has joined the OECD, so there's one country ranked below us. This is all true for 2013. So what do? Well, in order to grapple with this phenomenon, we in this government have set up a strategic plan that addresses this excess regulation monster on 4 fronts at the same time. And I will talk a little bit about each of these fronts so that you can understand what we do and where we're headed, and why I am certain that if this feedback is sweet-sour, if you got the sweet, or if you got the sweet until now, if you got the sour until now, why the sweet is yet to come. So the top right-hand corner is lowering the existing regulatory burden. We had mapped out every bureaucratic or regulatory interface between a government ministry and the Israeli citizen or Israeli business. We mapped 357 such interfaces, and we reached a decision that we are going to lessen the regulatory burden by 25% within 5 years, and so far we are meeting our goal. We have carried out 99 of the 357 steps. The last one was just last Friday, and I will describe it so that you can understand what this enemy is all about. It turns out that for every piece of clothing that we import from outside of Israel, we have to put a label on saying made in China. It's not enough that it says made in China. The Israeli law said until last Friday that we must also, when it comes to the port, take the boxes off the boat, take out this parcel of the shirts to create this new label that says made in China here in Israel, and then put it instead of the labels that it comes with initially, let's say made in China. Now this didn't happen because there were evil people around. Like every piece of regulation, not only in Israel but worldwide, the majority, 99.99% of the public are suffering so quietly that they don't understand that their shirts cost 2 shekels more. And by the way, 2 shekels here, 2 shekels there, it accumulates into dozens of millions of shekels. But there's this 0.0001 who enjoy regulation, who benefit from it. A factory that creates these labels, that's what they do. And of course there are regulators with good intentions who want to protect the consumers. And they are so intent on protecting consumers that they don't realize that they are actually making the consumer pay more. And the consumer doesn't notice it either. And this is just one of the 99 steps that we've taken. But that is the cost of living. And ladies and gentlemen, this is such hard work. And we did everything, mapped all of these out in order to have smart regulation in place. The second issue, I don't want to go into it too much. We have forced every government legislation and every resolution made by and decision made by every government clerk be looked into the regulatory impact. Have a regulatory impact assessment, RIA. It is no longer possible for a clerk in the Ministry of Economy. She can no longer decide that there is a new balance or a new check and balance that can actually be very beneficial and say, okay, from now on there's a new standard that all the businesses should have this new brake in their elevators. And of course this clerk thinks she's protecting the citizens of Israel. I am now obligating or insisting that every business have better brakes in their elevators. But what happens? This cost was 1.5 billion shekels for Israeli businesses, and there are no free lunches. These costs at the end of the day are paid by the consumer. They're passed on to the consumer. If you don't realize that the cost of living emanates from excess regulation, then stop believing it. This lie does not lie. So we started with government legislation. We also are imposing legislation on individual decisions. But we're not stopping new regulation from happening. It turns out that 98% of new regulation is redundant once these clerks and ministers have to do RIA, the assessment of the risk impact, of the regulation impact, but they have to tell us how much it will cost. And even though we have stopped 98% of the new regulation, there is still new regulation that is being imposed, like marking products, food products. But instead of deciding it one fine day, the Ministry of Health had to conduct an analysis, and they analyzed it, and they saw the benefits, and they showed us the cost. And that's why we went for it. We saw that it was beneficial. So first of all, we map out and we try to decrease the existing regulation. The next step is to do RIA for new regulation. And now this is the third step, protecting regulators. And I told the regulators, this is your mission. This is something we're doing quietly without anyone in Israel realizing it. This is the burden of the senior position holders. Do something quietly that will help everyone. And they said to me, Groner, if you manage to map all the regulatory processes, good for you. If you think you can impose RIA, good for you. And we're going to talk about the reform in business licensing soon. But they said the most important thing is protecting regulators. The clerks, ladies and gentlemen, were afraid. And they were afraid for good reason. No one gave them any credit for taking into consideration all the considerations and reaching a smart decision. But they were getting complaints if they had reached a decision that ultimately the worst case scenario happened. And what happened? What can we do? Sometimes the worst case scenario does take place. So after 2 years of intense discussions that I personally conducted, we reached a decision. And the decision was made by the state attorney that only the people who have the DNA of the public sector can understand the revolution. It says we recognize the need to have less excess regulation. We understand that it impacts the cost of living, and therefore, should a regulator decide, having reviewed all considerations, even if the worst case scenario should take place, we will not take legal criminal action against them. And if you're not in the public sphere, you don't understand what a big revolution this is. This is one of the biggest revolutions, and it's so significant that the economic media didn't even notice, but that's okay. It's very significant and very important. It also says that should an Israeli regulator adopt or embrace an international standard, even if a disaster should happen, then they won't be put on trial with criminal charges. And now the final piece of the puzzle, a reform in the business licensing law. And this is an amazing reform where the business people and the businesses we talked to just couldn't believe it. We are moving to a new model. We worked for 6 months very intensely in the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of the Interior to change this model of the business licensing. From the moment that we legislated, and we hope that we legislated in this current session, I personally came to the Committee of the Interior to promote this. We are shifting from a model where the business owner waits for the clerk to come from the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of such and such, all the relevant officers, and give them the approval. And by the way, because of all of these approvals, or not getting all of these approvals, more than half of the businesses in Israel are actually go without a business license and are criminals. And it would have been easier for people to stick their heads in the sand for 70 years, but no more. We are shifting to a declarative model. The business owner declares that he is meeting the criteria, the specification, and then of course there's supervision. But if the clerks do not get to a business that is not dangerous within 60 days or 45 for a more significant business, they will get the license immediately. And we're talking about many reforms in this country. But a reform is not just diverting the budget from here to there, making budgets bigger or smaller. A true reform is when you take the way you conducted yourself until a certain point and you completely change your behavior around from that day forth. And this business licensing move is a true game changer. And I see the time is almost up, so I want to show you where we have come and why Josephus was wrong. The World Economic Forum issues a report on competitiveness each year, the Global Competitiveness Report. And Israel in 2015 were number 27, and in 2017 we got to number 16, which is an amazing finding. But it's comprised of various subsections. And in the section of regulatory burden, we have come up from number 98 to number 41. Just 1 minute, please. This rise shows or demonstrates that the state of Israel has decreased more regulatory burden since 2015 than any other country in the world. And it's not the Director General of the Prime Minister's office saying that. It's not the Prime Minister himself saying that. It's the World Economic Forum. And I know that it doesn't match the talking points of many people who have gotten used to complaining and whining about the situation in Israel and about Israeli bureaucracy and about red tape. But it appears, and thankfully there is an objective, a global agency that checks this, and the next report will be in October, and I'm telling you we're going to be rated even higher. And I just want to end by saying, okay, this is the World Economic Forum, but there's also the OECD. And if you remember that slide, I showed you that how we were ranked in 2013. Well, now they're going to issue, in the second half of 2018, they're going to issue the updated report. And it took them 18 months to compile this report. And we got a draft of this report, which will be coming out in just a few months. And ladies and gentlemen, the state of Israel, yes, the state of Israel is the only country that is mentioned positively in this report. And again, it's not Groner, it's not Netanyahu saying so, it's the OECD, it's the World Economic Forum, and we're only at the beginning of the road. We have only just saved several billions until now. And some of these 99 steps require legislation, and we'll only get better at this. So I hope for all of our sakes that we continue on this road. And I want to say to all the government ministries and ministers and politicians, go with us and you'll get backup from myself and the Prime Minister. I tell the clerks there is no need to be afraid any longer. And I tell the citizens of Israel, make sure that we are on the right track, and understand finally that those who ask where's the money, why is it so expensive to live here, understand that it's excess regulation. We're addressing that. Thank you very much.